The year is 859 AD. A Muslim scholar in Cordoba receives a report that seems impossible. Vikings, the northern raiders known for terrorizing Atlantic coastlines, have attacked a city in North Africa. He reads it again. The geography doesn't add up. To reach North Africa from Scandinavia, the fleet would have had to sail the full length of Europe's Atlantic coast, pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, controlled by Islamic naval forces, and push deep into the Mediterranean. No northern force had ever done this. The report must be wrong. But 3 days later, another message arrives, then another. Reports come in from Sicily, from southern France, from islands that hadn't seen northern raiders in living memory. The Vikings aren't just in the Mediterranean, they're everywhere, and the question haunting the courts of Cordoba isn't how they got there. It's what else might be wrong about everything they believed. This is the story of a raid that didn't just terrify cities, it shattered assumptions that made an empire feel safe, and what followed would reshape Mediterranean warfare for generations. If you're interested in historical accounts that challenge familiar narratives and explore complexities often left out of mainstream sources, subscribe to stay informed. We focus on documented realities of history that deserve closer examination. More content like this is coming. To understand why 859 was so devastating, you have to go back 15 years to 844 AD and the city of Seville. The first warning came from a fishing village near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River. Strange ships had been spotted, dozens of them, moving upriver with clear intent. By the time the message reached Seville, the Vikings were already close. The garrison prepared for a siege. Civilians retreated behind the walls. Scouts counted the fleet, at least 80 ships, possibly more, thousands of warriors, but the Vikings didn't lay siege to Seville. They attacked at once. What followed were 7 days of fighting that revealed how unprepared Andalusi forces were for this kind of warfare. The Vikings didn't fight like conventional armies. They didn't set up camps or supply lines. They struck from the river, withdrew to their ships, then attacked again from new positions. The defenders couldn't predict where the next blow would fall. By the fourth day, parts of the outer defenses had been breached. Vikings flooded into residential districts. Fires spread through wooden buildings. The administrative quarter was looted. By the seventh day, organized resistance collapsed. The Vikings didn't occupy Seville. They didn't need to. They took what they wanted. Silver from the treasury, goods from warehouses, captives from the streets, then sailed back down the Guadalquivir, leaving behind a city that would take years to recover. The number of captives is debated, but Arabic sources suggest hundreds, possibly more than 1,000, were taken north to slave markets. The political fallout began before the fires were out. The Emir of Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman II, faced a crisis that went far beyond a battlefield loss. Seville wasn't a remote outpost. It was a major economic hub and a symbol of Andalusi prosperity. Its fall to northern raiders raised serious doubts about the Emirate's ability to defend its own heartland. The response had to be decisive, and it was. The reconstruction of Andalusi defenses after 844 was sweeping. Abd al-Rahman II didn't just rebuild Seville. He reimagined the entire Atlantic defense system. The first priority was naval power. Before 844, Al-Andalus had limited naval strength. Defense relied mainly on land forces. The sea was seen as a barrier, not a battlefield. That assumption changed. New shipyards were built along the Guadalquivir. Skilled shipbuilders were brought in from across the Islamic world. Within 3 years, a permanent war fleet was stationed near Seville. These ships were designed for river combat and coastal interception. They weren't converted merchant vessels. They were purpose-built warships, lighter than Mediterranean galleys, agile in river currents, equipped for boarding and ranged attacks. Crews were trained using tactics adapted from Byzantine naval doctrine, modified for river warfare. The objective was clear. If Viking ships ever entered the Guadalquivir again, they would face organized resistance long before reaching Seville. The second priority was early warning. A chain of coastal watchtowers was constructed from Galicia to the Strait of Gibraltar. Each tower was permanently staffed, stocked with provisions, and equipped with signaling tools. The system relied on visual communication. When one tower spotted Viking ships, signal fires were lit. The next tower would see the smoke and respond in kind. Messages that once took days now reached Cordoba in hours. The third priority was fortification. Seville's walls were expanded and reinforced. River defenses were added, including barriers that could be deployed to block ship passage. Garrisons were enlarged and trained in anti-raiding tactics. Similar upgrades were made in other coastal cities, Lisbon, Cadiz, Silves. By 850 AD, the entire Atlantic coast of Al-Andalus had been militarized. The system was tested repeatedly over the next decade. In 846, Viking ships probed the Galician coast. Watchtowers detected them immediately. Local forces responded before the raiders could establish positions. The Vikings withdrew after limited success. In 852, another fleet attempted to sail up the Tagus River toward Lisbon. Naval forces intercepted them at the river mouth. A battle followed, and the Vikings retreated. In 858, a small fleet appeared near the Guadalquivir. The city garrison mobilized at once. The Vikings didn't even try to enter the river. They turned north and vanished. Each incident confirmed the strategy. The defenses worked. The Atlantic threat had been neutralized through preparation, intelligence, and sustained readiness. By the summer of 859, 15 years after the trauma of Seville, confidence had returned to Cordoba. The northern raiders were understood. Their tactics were familiar. Their routes were monitored. Their capabilities had been measured and countered. The Viking problem seemed solved. That certainty would last about 6 weeks. In the summer of 859, the Watchtower network detected a large Viking fleet off the coast of Galicia. Early estimates put it at 60 to 80 ships, one of the largest seen in years, but size alone wasn't alarming. Large fleets had appeared before and been turned back. What mattered was the pattern. The fleet moved south along the Atlantic coast, raiding small settlements in Galicia. This fit known Viking behavior. They targeted weak villages, avoided strong defenses, and kept moving. When they reached Portuguese territory, they struck smaller ports. Again, this was expected. They were probing for weaknesses, testing response times, looking for easy targets. Reports streamed into Cordoba. Analysts tracked the fleet's movement and predicted its next moves. When the Vikings reached Lisbon, the response was already in place. The garrison was on alert. Naval forces waited offshore. Reinforcements had been sent from nearby towns. The Vikings attacked. The fighting lasted 2 days. They tried to break in at several points, but the defenses held. The garrison pushed them back. Naval units harassed their ships when they pulled away. After taking losses without gaining ground, the Vikings withdrew. From Cordoba's perspective, this was a textbook success. The defenses built after 844 had performed exactly as designed. The fleet continued south. When it approached the Guadalquivir, the site of Seville's fall 15 years earlier, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Every warship stationed at Seville was mobilized. Messengers raced up river to warn the city. Naval units took blocking positions at the river mouth. Additional troops were dispatched from Cordoba itself. This was the scenario all those preparations were meant for. The Vikings reached the entrance to the Guadalquivir and conducted reconnaissance. Small boats probed the defenses. Skirmishes broke out between Viking scouts and Andalusi patrol vessels. For 3 days, the two sides watched each other. Then the Vikings withdrew. There was no major battle, no attempt to force the river. They simply turned away and sailed south along the coast. In Cordoba, this was seen as final proof. The Vikings had tried the same strategy that worked in 844 and found a professional naval force waiting for them. They judged the cost too high and backed off. The threat had been deterred. Messages went out to regional commanders. Viking fleet repelled at the Guadalquivir. Defenses confirmed effective. maintain readiness, but threat level reduced. The fleet sailed past the last watchtower toward the southwestern tip of Iberia, and then something happened that no intelligence report had anticipated. The Vikings didn't turn north toward the Atlantic. They didn't sail west into the open ocean. They turned east toward the Strait of Gibraltar. At its narrowest point, the strait is just 14 kilometers wide. On a clear day, you can stand on the European shore and see the African coast with the naked eye. Ships crossed it all the time, merchant vessels, fishing boats, patrol ships. The crossing took hours, not days. Physically, the strait was a routine passage. Psychologically and strategically, it meant something far greater. It marked the boundary between the known and the unknown, between the Mediterranean world and the Atlantic, between waters controlled by Islamic powers and the chaos beyond. More importantly, it marked the line beyond which Viking raiders did not operate. This wasn't theory, it was backed by decades of experience. Vikings raided the Atlantic coasts of France, Brittany, England, Ireland, and Iberia. They sailed as far south as Morocco's Atlantic shore. They ranged across northern waters from the Baltic to the Irish Sea. But they did not enter the Mediterranean. The logic was simple. Viking longships were built for coastal raiding. Their shallow drafts let them move up rivers. Their speed allowed fast strikes and quick retreats. Their advantage was surprise and mobility. The Mediterranean offered none of that. It was a closed sea dominated by established naval powers. The Byzantine Empire, Islamic caliphates, and Italian city-states. These states maintained permanent fleets designed for Mediterranean warfare, with large crews meant for prolonged engagements and supported by dense port networks. A Viking fleet entering the Mediterranean would be sailing away from its supply lines, away from familiar waters, and into seas patrolled by experienced enemies. The longship's strengths, speed, surprise, the ability to vanish along open coasts, would be neutralized in an enclosed sea where ports were watched and coastlines controlled. Why take that risk when the Atlantic offered endless targets? This reasoning was so convincing that it shaped defensive planning across the Islamic Mediterranean. Coastal defenses were built to face known threats: Byzantine fleets, rival Islamic states, North African raiders, and occasional Christian attacks from Sicily or Italy. Not Vikings. Watchtower systems, naval patrols, and garrisons were all designed for dangers that emerged within the Mediterranean world. The Strait of Gibraltar was monitored, but the focus was on regulating trade and preventing enemy fleets from escaping into the Atlantic. The idea that northern raiders might enter the Mediterranean wasn't just unlikely. It was dismissed outright, not because the crossing was physically impossible, but because strategically it made no sense. The Vikings had never done it. They had no reason to start now. That certainty shaped deployments. When the Viking fleet approached the strait in the summer of 859, the patrols stationed there were not positioned to intercept a northern fleet trying to enter the Mediterranean. Because northern fleets didn't do that, and so the Vikings sailed through. There was no great battle at the strait, no dramatic last stand, no heroic defense of the gateway to the Mediterranean. The patrols weren't arranged for interception because no one expected interception to be necessary. When 60 to 80 Viking ships appeared and passed through, the response was confusion, followed by delayed alarm. By the time messages reached commanders who could authorize pursuit, the Vikings were already on the Mediterranean side. The moment they crossed, every defensive calculation in Al-Andalus collapsed. The watchtower network faced west, watching the Atlantic. Naval forces were stationed at Atlantic River mouths, the Guadalquivir, the Tagus, the Douro, not along the Mediterranean coast that had never seen Viking raids. Garrisons were concentrated in cities exposed to Atlantic approaches or river attacks, not spread along southern Iberia. The entire system assumed the threat came from one direction. The Vikings had just proven otherwise. Their first target was Algeciras, a port city on the Mediterranean side of the strait. It had defenses, but they were designed for familiar enemies and conventional warfare. When Viking longships appeared offshore, the garrison reacted, but it was responding to a kind of threat it had never trained for. The Vikings struck the port, seized supplies, and withdrew before organized resistance could form. Then they crossed to North Africa. From Algeciras to the Moroccan coast was less than 30 kilometers. An afternoon's sail, they landed near Necker. Necker was a major target. It was a regional capital, a trade center, and the seat of a local dynasty that controlled surrounding territory. The city had walls, a trained garrison, and a ruler whose authority was respected across the western Maghreb. What it didn't have was any expectation of Viking attack. The idea would have seemed absurd. Vikings belonged to the far north. Necker was in North Africa. They existed in different worlds, separated by vast distances and the assumed limits of geography. Yet in the summer of 859, Viking longships appeared off Necker's coast. The ruler, Musa ibn Musa, though some sources give his name differently, likely reacted with disbelief, followed by urgent mobilization. Defenses were activated, troops took their positions, civilians were moved behind inner walls. Messengers were sent to request reinforcements. The Vikings surrounded the city. What followed showed how effective Viking tactics could be against an unprepared enemy. They didn't conduct sieges like conventional armies. They didn't settle in for long blockades or build extensive siege works. Instead, they applied pressure at multiple points. Diversionary attacks drew defenders away while main assaults struck elsewhere. They used psychological pressure, showing a willingness to absorb losses, creating the impression of overwhelming numbers. Most importantly, they exploited uncertainty. The defenders didn't know how many Vikings there were, what their siege capabilities were, how long they could sustain an attack, or whether they would accept negotiation. This lack of information paralyzed decision-making. Without a framework to understand the enemy, the defenders couldn't calibrate their response. The siege lasted more than a week, though sources vary on the exact length. The Vikings launched repeated assaults. Whether they breached the walls or the city surrendered to avoid destruction is unclear. What is certain is the outcome. Necker fell. Musa ibn Musa was captured. The ruler of a major North African city had been taken prisoner by raiders who, according to every accepted assumption, should never have reached that coast. The Vikings occupied Necker for about 8 days, possibly longer. During that time, they systematically looted the city. Treasury wealth, trade goods, valuables from elite households. Anything portable was taken, but the most valuable cargo was human. Arabic sources report that hundreds of residents were seized, with some accounts claiming over 1,000. Men, women, and children were marched to the ships and loaded aboard. These captives were not taken at random. They were commodities. Viking society had a well-established slave trade. Prisoners were transported to markets in Scandinavia, Ireland, or Francia. Wealthy captives could be ransomed. Others were sold as labor. The occupation of Necker followed this logic. The city wasn't destroyed. Destroying it would have erased its future value. Instead, it was stripped of wealth and people. After 8 days, the Vikings withdrew, sailing back to Iberia with their plunder and captives. For those left behind in Necker, the ordeal was devastating but temporary. The city recovered. Musa ibn Musa was eventually ransomed or released and appears in later records. But the psychological impact reached far beyond Necker, because if Vikings could reach Necker, they could reach anywhere. The raid was not the end of the Viking campaign, it was the beginning. Over the next 3 years, from 859 to 862, the same fleet continued operating across the western Mediterranean. They didn't set up permanent bases or try to conquer territory. Instead, they carried out systematic raids, exploiting a single advantage, being present where no one expected them. The Balearic Islands were struck repeatedly. Mallorca and Minorca, both under Islamic control, had never planned for northern raiders. Their defenses were built for familiar Mediterranean threat, rival fleets, pirates, or military expeditions from hostile states. When the Vikings arrived, they hit coastal settlements, seized goods and captives, and withdrew before regional naval forces could respond. They raided the coast of southern France. The Camargue, the delta of the Rhone River, was attacked. Settlements were burned and trade routes disrupted. Frankish authorities, already stretched thin by internal conflict and Viking pressure in northern France, were unprepared for raids coming from the Mediterranean side. They struck coastal cities in Islamic Iberia as well. Towns that had invested heavily in Atlantic defenses discovered their Mediterranean shores were exposed. The Vikings made it clear that the system built after 844 only protected certain directions. Some sources suggest the fleet sailed as far east as the Italian coast. These accounts are debated. Some historians question whether the 859 fleet actually reached that far or whether later writers confused separate Viking groups. Even so, the possibility itself shows how far perceptions of the threat had shifted. What is clear is the duration. This wasn't a single summer raid followed by a return north. The fleet stayed in the Mediterranean for years, operating continuously and returning to the same regions again and again. That persistence created constant pressure on every coastal power in the western Mediterranean. No one knew where the Vikings would strike next or when they would finally leave. Traditional defensive measures, fortifying key cities, maintaining patrols, responding after attacks, proved insufficient against raiders who could appear anywhere along hundreds of kilometers of coastline. The Vikings had turned the Mediterranean's geography into a weapon against the states that controlled it. By 861, regional authorities began coordinating their responses. Islamic and Christian powers in Iberia shared intelligence about Viking movements. Naval patrols increased. Coastal communities were warned to stay on high alert. But the Vikings weren't defeated in battle. They left on their own terms, sometime between 861 and 862. The exact date is uncertain. The fleet departed the Mediterranean, though whether it sailed back through the Strait of Gibraltar or took another route remains unknown. What lingered was a question: would they return? The Viking campaign of 859 to 862 conquered no land, founded no colonies, and overthrew no governments. Measured in conventional terms, territory gained, dynasties ended, borders changed. The impact was limited, but measured by what it revealed, the consequences were lasting. The raids proved that assumptions about geography, threat directions, and enemy capabilities could be shattered by forces willing to challenge them. The Emirate of Cordoba responded by shifting naval forces toward the Strait of Gibraltar. In later decades, Viking fleets attempting to enter the Mediterranean encountered organized resistance. Some were turned back. Others fought their way in, but faced prepared defenses throughout their campaigns. By the early 10th century, Viking activity in the Mediterranean had declined to isolated incidents. The system adapted, but it never regained the confidence it had before 859. Because once you've seen an impossible threat become real, you understand that impossible isn't a safeguard. It's just a line no one has tested yet. And boundaries, as history shows, are far easier to cross than those who draw them ever expect.